Yes, I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Looks like I was having some technical difficulties with my phone. Sorry for the delay, folks, and we're going to be starting the webinar now. And I was trying to say, if anybody's having any technical difficulties with either the audio or the computer portion of the webinar, the number to call is the 1-800-263-6317. As I was trying to say, and my microphone was not working earlier, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar on the anti-counterfeit certification programs. Today we have 3 speakers to talk to you about these anti-counterfeit certification programs. Mr. Matthew Shindell, he's a special counsel in the law firm of Goldberg, Sagalla in Philadelphia, where he works in the practice in the defense and product liability matters involving industrial equipment as well as consumer products. Mr. Shindell is a fellow of the American Board of Trial Advocates, and he's also a member of CAMA, the Counterfeit Avoidance Mark Alliance. Mr. Todd Kramer, who is the CEO of Secure Components, and Secure Components is the first organization in the world to achieve an accredited certification to the AS6081 standard. Secure Components is located just outside of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, and Mr. Kramer is also an industry veteran with vast experience working with the DoD and the aerospace supply chain. He's also an expert in counterfeit avoidance by participating in various groups, both domestically and internationally, including the United States National Committee, International Electrotechnical Commission, the ANSI-ASQ. And he also serves as a chairman of that same entity in the Distributors Advisory Group, and he is very active in the SAE G19 committee developing a number of standards associated with counterfeit avoidance and mitigation. Myself, I'm Sidney Vianna. I am the Director of Aviation, Space, and Defense for DNV, Business Assurance. DNV is a certification body with a global footprint. I'm also a member of the leadership team of the America's Aerospace Quality Group, and I am involved with the effort of under the IAQG to rewrite the AS9100 family of documents. And finally, I'm also a senior member of the American Society for Quality. The agenda for today's webinar, we're going to talk about the counterfeit in the aviation, space, and defense sectors. Mr. Shindell is going to talk to us about that subject. Then Mr. Kramer is going to talk to us about the standards that have been and are being developed as we speak related to the subject, and he is also going to talk to us about certification programs and the conformity assessment programs to those standards. He then is going to spend some time describing the journey of Secure Components for achieving the first accredited AS6081 certification in the world. After that, I'll be speaking for a few minutes on the perspective of a certification body working in this type of program. And at the end of this presentation, Mr. Kramer is going to come back and talk to us about the Counterfeit Avoidance Mark Alliance, or CAMA. For those of you who are interested in asking any questions, please, you will be able to ask questions using the chat box feature of the GoToWebinar application. We will not be answering questions during the webinar, but feel free to type in your questions along the way. And at the end of the webinar, we do have planned for a Q&A session to answer all your questions. Also, be aware that this webinar is being recorded for on-demand viewing later on. And also, all of the attendees will be receiving an email with a copy of today's presentation. Okay. So without further ado now, I'm going to pass this on to Matt Shindell, and he's going to talk to us about the counterfeit in the aviation space and defense sector. So Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Sidney. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I want to thank DMV, Secure Components, and the AS6081 for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I am filling in for Stan Salat, who's the President and CEO of ECC Corporation, who's currently in Australia, speaking to their military about the issues we are discussing today. As Sidney mentioned, I'm an attorney at the Philadelphia office of Goldberg, Sagalla. My firm consists of approximately 200 attorneys in 11 offices throughout the northeastern United States and London. I focus my practice upon the defense of suppliers and manufacturers of consumer products and industrial equipment. Today, I'm going to discuss the legal repercussions manufacturers in the aviation, space, and defense sectors may face if they fail to comply with certain industry and government standards. Now, everyone has a broad awareness of the challenges associated with the distribution of counterfeit parts. However, few companies or individuals really take the time to assess the business risks related to this problem and neglect to formulate adequate mitigation, detection, or authentication programs. Now, I was amazed about how serious this problem was after reading about the November 8, 2011 United States Committee on Armed Services hearing regarding counterfeit electronic parts in the defense supply chain, which was led by Senators McCain and Levin. This problem starts with e-waste, which is discarded electrical parts or devices sent to China or other countries from the United States. They are disassembled by hand, washed in a dirty river, and dried on the sidewalk. These parts are then sanded down to remove the existing part number or other markings that indicate its quality or performance. Subsequently, special equipment is used to place false markings on the parts to lead the average person to think they are new or high-quality parts. The counterfeit parts are then packaged and sold on the internet to buyers who have no idea that they're fake. Alarmingly, experts who testified at this hearing estimate that as much as 15% of all spare and replacement parts purchased by the Pentagon are counterfeit. The dangers associated with counterfeit parts are not limited to just the supply chain from the defense supply chain. In 2010, the Government Accountability Office published a report that states United States businesses lose $250 billion annually due to counterfeiting. Moreover, the Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association estimates that the United States automotive parts industry has lost $3 billion in sales to counterfeit goods alone. Just last week, Toyota brought forth a lawsuit in California against a supplier who was distributing catalytic converters. Apparently, the supplier was mixing fake or counterfeit catalytic converters with real ones to disguise them and sold them to buyers like Toyota. Now, that example in itself shows how this problem can affect even the largest corporations and why it's extremely important to have procurement procedures and inspection protocols in place to mitigate the risks associated with the distribution of counterfeit parts. Next slide, please. After the November 8th hearing, Congress introduced sweeping legislation to curb the distribution of counterfeit parts in the defense supply chain. On December 31, 2011, President Barack Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2012 into law. Section 18 of this law was enacted to fight product piracy and covers all Department of Defense contractors or subcontractors or anyone in the supply chain who supplies electronic parts or products that include electronic parts. The main purpose of Section 818 is to establish inspection, testing, detection, authentication, and reporting requirements for all Department of Defense contractors. Department of Defense contractors are required whenever possible to obtain electronic parts that are in production or currently available in stock from the original manufacturers of the parts or their authorized dealers. If the electronic parts are not in production or are out of stock, the parts have to be purchased from trusted suppliers. Now, the definition of trusted suppliers is still being worked out, but I think by the end of this webinar, you should have a better understanding of what that term means. Regardless, I like to think of a trusted supplier as someone who's a trustworthy supplier, because you know that they went through the appropriate assessment to get accredited, which indicates that they're in compliance with the pertinent industry standards. Now, under Section 818, Department of Defense contractors must establish policies and procedures to inspect and test electronic parts, develop mechanisms to trace where the parts came from, and develop programs to report and quarantine counterfeit or suspect counterfeit parts. Next slide, please. Section 818 also has severe penalties for Department of Defense contractors who fail to comply with the standards that I just mentioned. Whoever traffics goods knowing they're counterfeit goods that will malfunction or will likely cause serious injury or death shall be subject to the following penalties. An individual can be fined up to $2 million, imprisoned up to 10 years, or both for the first offense. A corporation or company can be fined up to $5 million for the first offense. An individual who commits a second offense or subsequent offense shall be fined up to $5 million, imprisoned up to 20 years, or both. And the second offense committed by a corporation or company can lead to a fine of up to $5 million. It's important to realize that everyone in the supply chain is subject to these penalties, not just the counterfeiters themselves. Recently, an individual in Massachusetts was charged by the Department of Justice with importing counterfeit semiconductors from China for sale in the United States, and they were intended for use in nuclear submarines. Well, that example in itself not only shows the obvious dangers associated with counterfeit parts, because those in our armed forces can suffer personal injuries from a defective part like that, but it also indicates that Section 818 will be enforced if Department of Defense contractors distribute counterfeit parts. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about some standards, some industry standards. Todd's going to talk about them in greater detail later in this seminar, but I want to touch upon a few important aspects of two of these standards. AS6081 is a quality standard that was authored by SAE International through various committees to provide a high level of protection against counterfeit components for customers in the aerospace and defense industry and the global supply chain. It sets forth best practices and requirements for use by distributors of electronic parts. It was recently adopted by the Department of Defense, which essentially indicates the standard has received a good housekeeping seal of approval. So basic requirements of AS6081 are to help distributors identify reliable sources of pure parts, evaluate and mitigate risks associated with the distribution of counterfeit parts, and set forth policies to report suspect or actual counterfeit parts to potential users and the proper authorities. SAE, next slide please. SAE also recently implemented AS5553A, which has similar requirements to AS6081. However, it pertains to manufacturers. But it's important for manufacturers to look toward AS6081 distributors for purchases outside of authorized channels to mitigate the risks associated with purchasing or distributing counterfeit parts. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to talk about a legal theory known as strict liability. Now, whenever an individual suffers personal injuries from a defective product, they can bring forth a civil action against a manufacturer or anyone in the supply chain. Every jurisdiction has a different version of it. However, the most important thing to realize is that anyone in the supply chain can be responsible for an accident from a defective part regardless of whether they exercise reasonable care to ensure that the product is safe. All an injured party has to prove is that the product was defective before it left the supplier's control, and this defect caused their injuries. The rationale is that the risk of loss, the injury from the defective product, should be borne by the supplier, but they are in a position to absorb the loss by distributing it as a cost of doing business. Now, while it may be impossible to completely prevent the distribution of counterfeit parts into the supply chain, it's extremely important they make sure your company complies with the standards I just mentioned to protect their business interests and the safety of their customers. Complying with these standards and regulations will reduce the availability of counterfeit parts in the supply chain and will substantially mitigate the associated liability risks facing your company. And with that, I want to pass the baton along to Todd Kramer, who is going to speak about anti-counterfeit standards and conformity assessment programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Very, very interesting perspective from legal counsel in terms of the assessment programs, the standards that we're talking about. And for this part of the segment, I wanted to focus in on how the standards tie into the conformity assessment programs. So before I get involved with that, I want to kind of go over the standards in a little bit of detail here. As Matt had mentioned, there are 3 standards that were really kind of focused around counterfeit avoidance. The first being 5553A, the second being the 6081, and the third being the 6174. As Matt had mentioned, the 5553A and the 6081 are pretty similar. The 5553A is for manufacturers, and the 6081 is more for distributors. And the 6174 is very similar to those other 2 I've mentioned, but these are specific to components that are not necessarily electronic, so everything other than electronic components. Next slide, please. So looking at these standards and the conformity assessment programs in place, how do we eradicate the counterfeit avoidance? How do we get the electronic components that are really failing our men and women in the military, as well as other commercial applications? We've got to be able to eradicate this, and the way to do that is not by putting up borders around our country. And I go to all these conferences, I go to lots of seminars, and the same rhetoric keeps going over and over again. It's, don't buy from China. Don't buy from Asia because that's where the bad parts are. But anybody in our industry really knows that the parts are manufactured in Taiwan and China. That's where they are. There are counterfeiters out there, but at the same time, these are where legitimate components are being manufactured and distributed out of. So we can't put the borders around our own country and just pretend that there's only one spot or one place to buy components from. The second is to make sure that this international supply chain recognizes these standards that have been written and authored by SAE and the G19 committees. Second, or thirdly, I should say, the training programs are very, very important. These training programs are able to take the certification bodies, such as DMV, and make sure that they understand how to go about the assessment. How do they do the audit that is very similar to the same audit that's being done in China, or Japan, or Korea, or in Europe? That's what conformity assessment is about, making sure that these standards are being audited the same way across the globe. The next part of this slide talks about international accreditation of the certification bodies. The next step in developing a program is to make sure that it's accredited. That's a very, very important aspect to what we're talking about. Anybody can claim that they're compliant to anything that they're following, but it's a much different assessment when a third party comes in, and that same third party is doing the assessment the same way in the United States as it is in Asia. Lastly, what I wanted to talk about is there's a potential for counterfeiting of even certificates. So the AS6081 has taken the liberty to develop a centralized database that is password protected, that is, basically, well, I'm not going to say impossible because, as we all know, counterfeiters can find a way to do anything, but we've made it very, very difficult for them to copy the certificates. And if you click on the next slide, that URL will take you to the actual certification that is listed online, and that's where it resides. So as you can see, if you take a quick look, this was issued just a couple of weeks ago, and as Sidney said, this is the first of its kind in the world. And you go to the next slide here. Here's where it kind of makes a little bit of sense on how to divide up all the different areas which compromise or make up the program. On the left-hand side, you see all the different aerospace standards. You have the 5553, you have the 6081, and you also have the criteria that govern the audit. Moving over to the right, you see where it says the AS6081 03-7. These are the operating documents and the rules of procedures that we have developed within the AS6081, specifically with the Working Group 6. And we put together all of these rules so that, again, the auditors can get trained to these and everyone is on the same page. As you move over further to the right, this is where you go through the accreditation process. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with ANAB. That is one of the accreditation bodies throughout the world. And obviously the American National Accreditation Body or Board is United States National Committees, or the United States version of accreditation. Last but not least, the certification bodies are able then to become accredited, they're trained, and then they can roll out and send out certificates to organizations that achieve this success. Next slide, please. One of the most important aspects to the standards that we're talking about and the certification programs that we are referring to is the chain of custody. What is chain of custody, and what does it mean when it's been broken? And how do you actually provide that transparency when traceability is there so your end user knows of the level of degree of risk associated with this type of procurement? So when you look at demonstrating authenticity, you want to make sure that you have absolutely documented, or you have asked your supplier to have documented every single interval from the time that the component was manufactured by the OCM to the manufacturers, to the distributors, so on and so forth down the supply chain. And again, each change of ownership must be documented and must be kept with the parts and the orders. Another thing to take into consideration is if the parts were sold to an unauthorized source, such as an OEM or an end user, and they generated or they did their project and unfortunately they had some pieces left over for excess, those are now considered unauthorized because we're not sure how those parts were kept. Were they kept in an ESD safe environment, and was the integrity of the parts kept at all times? So once that chain of custody has been broken outside the authorized channels, it's quite important to just make note of that and to determine what the risks are associated by procuring those parts from other sources. Next slide, please. This is a slide I like to look at horizontally and vertically. From the left-hand side, the OEM is the original source that's going to put out the flow-down requirement of whatever the requirements are, and it's very imperative that the OEM flows it down to company A, who's the first-tier supplier, and the first-tier supplier flows that down to the second tier, to the third tier, so on and so forth, all the way down the line. The key is to know that each supplier is compliant or certified to determine the risk factors. Next slide, please. Here's another example of how the program has come together and how the standards really tie into the conformity assessment programs. Obviously, on the left-hand side, we have these international standards that we've spoken about. We've developed the programs, the operating documents, and the rules of procedures through the IACQ. We then go through an accreditation process. You train the certification bodies to be able to do the assessment, and at the end, hopefully, you have successful results with a certification. Next slide, please. That brings me to the end of the second segment, and lucky enough for me, you guys have me for another back-to-back segment, which is the certification journey of secure components. And I'm going to kind of get into the trials, the tribulations, all the struggles that we had, and hopefully give you a good picture of all the speed bumps that were along the way. Just to give you a brief background on secure components, we are a small business, as you can see. We have 11 people working here in Norristown, Pennsylvania. We are an AS9120 certified company, ISO 9001 certified. As we've mentioned, we're AS6081 certified, and the new QTSL certification is a qualified list of suppliers that have been, I guess, pre-audited and selected to supply the Department of Defense, specifically DLA, with microcircuits and semiconductors. They all kind of play into each other, so I wanted to list them. Next slide, please. So when secure components started, we knew that we had to raise the bar. Our industry, and specifically brokers and independent distributors, have always been known to be deceptive, unscrupulous, and so a lot of that was due to the fact that there were things in our industry over the last decade or two that were just simply too good to be true. I love these two slides here. One of my favorite movies is Trading Places, and if you've seen the movie, everyone probably realizes that in an instant, Eddie Murphy went from becoming a homeless bum to literally becoming an overnight millionaire. There was something that was just too good to be true with that picture. Same thing with the housing bubble. You had people buying, multi-million-dollar houses, but they were making $35,000 a year. Something was not right. Things were just too good to be true. And the same thing really happened with electronic components. Coming from an industry and being in it for so long, I saw where supply and demand didn't equal the prices that we were paying. Things were just too good to be true. If the supply was so low and the demand is so high, then it was impossible to find these parts at deep, deep discounts, versus if it was a real authentic part and the supply was so low, well, there'd be a premium to be paid for those components. Next slide, please. So when we decided to become different and raise the bar, we did that from learning and from attending conferences and learning that buying cheap and selling high is not really a good sense of business and really does not provide value to our customers. We certainly educated ourselves associated with E-waste, and as Matt mentioned, unfortunately it seems that we've created our own problem. All these major industrial countries take their computers, take their cell phones, take all of these electronic components that they no longer have a need for, and they dispose of them. They get shipped over to third world countries, and we basically said, hey, let's recycle, let's reuse, and that's exactly what they've done. But unfortunately, we recognize that the risks and the dangers that are associated with this simply do not weigh, the benefits of trying to buy something for cheap. I mean, men and women that are in the lines of fire deserve better, and that's what secure components set out to do. Next slide, please. We certainly were able to learn for the past few years after the National Defense Authorization Act was signed by President Barack Obama, specific to Section 818, and especially after the Senate Arms Committee with Senators McCain and Levin reported that there was over 1 million counterfeit components in our defense supply chain. Think about that, 1 million components. They're estimated to be about $6 billion worth of damages and reworks caused by these counterfeit components. These are serious financial repercussions, and not only that, now with these new laws, legal ramifications are also in place. And Matt mentioned there are some severe penalties, including prison and severe financial penalties. Next slide, please. So Secure Components decided to take action. We joined a bunch of different committees, including the United States National Committee. Prior to the joining of that committee, brokers and distributors, especially inside the United States, did not have a voice, did not have any kind of way to voice their opinion at any kind of national or international venue. And the United States National Committee does just that. They are members, they're one country member of 18 that are involved with the International Electrotechnical Committee. So there are 18 national, member bodies that are nationalities. I've mentioned them, again, they're Korea, Japan, China, United States, Germany, France, Australia, United Kingdom, all of the major countries that we're all familiar with. And we get together and we decided that this program that the AS6081 was promoting, in fact, was something that industry wanted, and just in April it was voted in Singapore to adopt it as an official program. Another group that we joined within the AS6081, the US ANSI-ASQ, was the Distributors Advisory Group. And the Distributors Advisory Group is made up of independent distributors and brokers who are in the realm or trying to become separated from all of the other unscrupulous brokers. And we have dedicated a section of the Counterfeit Avoidance Mark Alliance to specifically DAG members who are distributors. And then we have another section of CAMA who are associate members, such as Matt Shindell's firm, Goldberg and Sagalla, as well as some other technologies and other types of firms other than distributors. I also joined the SAG19C committee, which helps develop the criteria for the 6301. That's the governing criteria for the 6081 audit. And last but not least, we had the opportunity to co-found with the ECC Corporation, the Counterfeit Avoidance Mark Alliance, which I'll have an opportunity to get into a little bit later. Next slide, please. As I had mentioned, Secure Components certainly had a lot of hurdles. I like to call them speed bumps, but we really had to stay committed in order to reach the successful results that we have encountered. As with any kind of business proposition, financial burdens are always accounted for. And this was no different. Being one of the first, being the first company in the world to go through this, we incurred consultation costs as well as our certification costs, and we estimate that to be in the neighborhood of between $40,000 to $50,000. We had resources and tons of man hours that were dedicated to training, thus taking them away from our course of business, and that was frustrating, but had to be done, as well as the energy that it took for many late nights that we were here. I remember being here 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, making sure that document control was right, that every procedure was documented right, the revisions were right. So many late hours. Not to also mention the hand-to-hand combat that we had, developing the words and the phrases that were incorporated into the operating documents and the rules of procedures within the AS60AQ. And last but not least, something that was really interesting that all distributors and any kind of, I guess, manufacturer should be aware of who is going to go down this road of counterfeit avoidance. One of the interpretations that came out of ANAB about a third of the way through our audit was the fact that the certification body that was doing the counterfeit avoidance plan certification or audit had to also be the same certification body to do the quality management system audit. So we had another certification body that we had a relationship with for the last 4 years, and because they were not part of the IEC system, we had to look out for or look for another certification body, and it was a fantastic fit with DNV, who became the first accredited certification body to be able to do this assessment. So it was just really important to point that out, that the total time took 6.5 days of assessment on an 11-person company, but the reason really was, the interpretation was, that the certification body had to do both assessments. Next slide, please. This is a quick flow-down chart I wanted to put up there, which kind of shows exactly how things lie. On the top, you have your quality management system. Below that, you have your counterfeit parts mitigation policy. Underneath that, you have your plan, your counterfeit parts control plan. Underneath that, all the training of your personnel gets taken care of. To the right of that, all your internal audits. And one more key thing to point out on this flow chart as you move your way down, the purchasing process needs to be revised, and that's a very, very important aspect in terms of the 6081. Next slide, please. Well, with all those hurdles, speed bumps, came successful results. We were very, very happy to see our improvement to our overall business and quality systems. Going through this really, uncovered a lot of different snags that we had personally, and so being able to look at it from the 50,000-foot view again enabled us to do some vast improvements. We were able to take on leadership roles, such as representing the United States distributors and brokers at the international level and promoting the international programs that we've been able to achieve. One of the most important aspects of our learning process was that we now know how to effectively purchase from foreign entities. As I mentioned, you can't put up those walls around the borders, but there certainly are some different cultures out there, and to be able to purchase from those cultures in an effective way, in a compliant way, is very, very effective. Last but not least, we were able to participate in founding the not-for-profit CAMA organization, and in the end, we have the first ever certification for counterfeit avoidance. I think that is my last slide. Sidney, if you want to give me that, I will turn it over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd, and don't go very far because I only have a couple of slides to talk about the perspective from a certification body on this program. So I would like to talk to you all about as either a certification body or more as a conformity assessment body. It's very important for DNV that we are involved with programs that are really part of the material issues affecting industry and society at large. So as already mentioned by Todd and Matt, counterfeit goes way beyond military applications, go way beyond aerospace, and we believe that society at large is going to find ways of promoting better assurance in the supply chain, be it of consumer goods, be it in spacecraft, be it in military aviation, but society and industry will find ways of trying to mitigate risks in all of these different supply chains. And part of this risk mitigation strategy is have, once again, auditing and certification programs that add value to the stakeholders in the process. So myself, as a member of the America's Aerospace Quality Group, I had a chance to witness many conversations around the topic of counterfeit. In the early stages of the AAQG, there was even discussions if the G14 group under SAE should be involved with developing the standards specifically related to counterfeit avoidance. For different reasons, that was decided not to take place. And luckily for us, we have people like Mr. Phil Zulieta from NASA JPL, who is leading the effort under the SAE G19 group of developing all of these standards that, once again, should be perceived as a risk mitigation aspect of counterfeiting the supply chains. Both Matt and Todd already spoke about the standards that are being developed under the G19 committee, the 6081, the 5553 Revision A, and 6174. From a certification body's perspective, we think that it is extremely important that if we are going to have certification programs to demonstrate conformity against those standards, that the conformity assessment piece needs to be reliable, needs to be robust. So to that effect, as already extensively mentioned, we have accreditation programs being put in place. The first one in the world that at least I am aware of is the one that came through the ANSI-ASQ. Todd mentioned that ANAB, the accreditation agency in the U.S. for management system certification, is also working together with the ANSI-ASQ, and we should be seeing an ANAB accreditation program for 6081 and 5553 in the near future, and definitely DNV will be in that mix. So we will definitely going to be seeking accreditation with ANAB for those standards. I believe that the reason why we don't have an accreditation program yet under ANAB for the 6081 standard is that we are trying to finalize the AS6301 document, which is the criteria to the verified conformance of a distributor to 6081. So as you can tell, there are a number of standards out there, a number of new programs, new criteria, new requirements, and we are learning how to navigate all the different standards as we go along. As I already mentioned about the G19, also being a member of the leadership team of the AAQG, I can mention that the IAQG, the International Aerospace Quality Group, is developing some guidance material that's going to be provided to the industry through the Supply Chain Management Handbook. If any of you are not familiar with that website, which is a subset of the IAQG website, I definitely encourage you to become familiar with the Supply Chain Management Handbook, or SCMH for short, because there is a tremendous amount of information available to the supply chain on a number of subjects, and counterfeit avoidance is an extremely important subject, and I believe that we can benefit from any and each material that we can get a hold of. And also, what you see on the screen, on the right side of the screen, I'd like to mention that there are a number of discussion groups in LinkedIn related to the counterfeit standards. The snapshot that you see there is from one of the AS91XX discussion groups, but this gentleman, Mr. Henry Livingston, he's been providing tremendous amount of useful information in LinkedIn about, for example, the DoD adoption and acceptance of standards being released by the SAE. And the last thing I'd like to mention here was already talked about by Todd, is the fact that under the current program for 6081 certification, the requirements coming from the actual 6081 standard is that the certification body performing an audit of the counterfeit program by a distributor against the 6081 standard would also have to basically make that audit in combination with an audit of the quality management system of that distributor. And according to the requirements of 6081, the distributor should either fall and be certified to ISO 9001 or the SAE AS9120 document. So like Todd mentioned, when we were engaged by Secure Components, at that time they were certified by another certification body, part of the IAQG program, but due to the fact that the 6081 basically requires the audits to be done in a combined fashion, we had to actually transfer the AS9120 of Secure Components to a DNV certificate, and upon achieving our accreditation via the ANSI-ASQ, we were able and very proudly be able to issue the first ANSI-ASQ accredited 6081 certificate to Secure Components. So for those of you who are watching this webinar, just be aware that there are some peculiar requirements to this accredited certification program, and we're going to be able to answer your questions later on. With that said, I pretty much covered my part of the presentation, and now we're going to have Mr. Kramer back to talk about the Counterfeit Avoidance Mark Alliance, or CAMA. So Todd, back to you, please.
Thank you very much, Sidney. CAMA stands for Counterfeit Avoidance Mark Alliance. And the idea behind CAMA was really to become the center of excellence for counterfeit avoidance, detection, mitigation. It really does follow the standards, and it's a membership-based international organization who has brought together all types of organizations, whether it's distributors, manufacturers, franchise, independents, brokers, test labs, law firms, or even technologies to help detect counterfeits. CAMA is an organization which is looking for membership that has any adverse risk to counterfeits. So in Goldberg's Sagalla's case, they are representing aerospace and defense contractors as well as commercial manufacturers. And so, their reliability and their liability, in fact, is on the line here. So we have been able to really coordinate and recruit many different organizations that together is bringing forth a network of independent and franchise distributors and brokers that are covering a wide range of products and services. So one of the benefits of becoming a member is that supply chain and being able to use the network, and that includes thousands of companies that have already become certified to various standards within the industry. So the next part of CAMA was to be able to take the standards development organizations such as SAE, and there are other standard bodies out there that write these standards throughout the world, and to make sure that there is conformity assessment in regards to those standards, and to also make sure that it is an accredited system. So CAMA is bringing together the countries involved, which I had mentioned in the past. There are 18 of them. And within those 18 countries, they have certification bodies that are interested because industry is driving the need for these programs like the counterfeit avoidance. Training and consulting organizations would certainly become part of our group. And we also have 1,100 small business development centers. We are associated through a memorandum of understanding, and we are able to do and provide training to all sorts of organizations. Next slide, please. Our website is www.counterfeitavoidance.org. We have been able to set up conferences and meetings with some high-level, I should say, industry behemoths, to be quite honest with you. The Counterfeit Avoidance Mark Alliance and the Distributors Advisory Group, which resides underneath that umbrella, is able to meet with different groups such as the Avionic Advisory Group. That is led by Lloyd Condra. He's a senior technical fellow at Boeing. And they have been a very, very helpful driving force behind these programs. They've been working on this for years. And the avionics groups has some other Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 500 companies within them. Besides the avionics group and besides the distributors advisory group, there's also the laboratories advisory group. And inside the laboratories advisory groups are leading laboratories that deal with chemical and physical analysis as well as electronic functionality testing. So we've been able to bring together a community where we have all of the distributors, we have independent test laboratories, we have the avionics groups kind of telling us exactly what is needed to provide them with that risk mitigation, so industry and brokers and distributors can follow suit and get to a level and a degree of confidence where people don't have to look at brokers and distributors as unscrupulous or deceiving. And in conclusion, counterfeiting of electronic components, including extension cords, toasters, Rolex watches, Gucci bags, any item for that matter, is driven by those that knowingly buy the cheapest thing that they can. By regulations that mandate that you recycle, reuse, and reclaim everything possible without planning for the potential outcomes of such regulations. Unfortunately, we often reward such buying habits with raises and promotions. But maybe it's time for executive management, design engineers, component engineers, buyers, and quality management, and others with influence over these buying practices to own up to the fact that they are responsible and the only ones with the power to really eradicate this international counterfeiting pandemic. The use of international standards like AS5553A or AS6081 or AS6174, coupled with programs like IACQ, counterfeit avoidance, and the Conformity Assessment Rules of Procedures QC03-7, as well as ANAB's accreditation rules, provide the ingredients necessary to bring the global supply chain back under control. The first IACQ counterfeit avoidance plan certification based on the AS6081 has taken place, setting the stage for the global supply chain leaders to follow. And guess what? They're going to follow sooner than you think. It's time for industry to lean out the windows and shout out, hey, we're mad. We're mad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore. You either achieve third-party certification so that we can trust you, or we simply won't buy your cheap products anymore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd. and thanks again to Matt. We do have a few questions waiting to be answered here, and I don't know if Todd and Matt, you guys have a chance to look at the questions, but I can read them for you. The first question that we have to answer here comes from my colleague Filippo. He was asking, and probably this question is better suited to Matt. The question is, why Section 818 is only limited to electronic parts? Is that a fact, or, and if it's true, why is that limited to electronics?
It's my understanding that it's not just limited to electronic parts. It's any parts that are sent into the defense supply chain.
The standards itself were written regarding electronic components, but as we've mentioned now, AS6174 also revolves around non-electronic components. So
right.
As Matt had said, the understanding is that anything that's counterfeit would be, kind of considered, but the heart of the matter is, and the brains of a lot of these operations are microcircuits and semiconductors and electronic components. So that's where a lot of the focus is right now.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so yeah, just confirming, Filippo, both 6081 and 5553, yeah, they deal with electronic devices, but the 818 regulation is not limited to electronic devices. The other question here, it's a kind of a long question. Let me break this down. Probably, Todd, this would be better answered by you. Basically, the question is, would it be effective and economical if the suppliers involved in the supply chain would to mark the parts that could be with some kind of stamp or seal or with some kind of mark that the end user could basically, quote unquote, confirm that the part has been through the chain of custody that you mentioned, and that chain of custody is, quote unquote, assured by this mark or stamp or seal on the part itself. What can you say about that?
I think I know what you're referring to or what the question was asking. There is a new technology out that was adopted and implemented by the Department of Defense, and that is a DNA marking. The company out of Long Island is called Applied DNA Sciences, and fortunately they have been to a number of these conferences where I've had an opportunity to get to know the technology and better understand it. It was originally set out to provide authenticity of traceability from the OCM. So originally it was set out for all of the original component manufacturers to manufacture their parts, to apply this DNA marking, which is a botanical substance, and at the end of the supply chain, when the end user received these parts in, they'd be able to use it under some sort of special fluorescent lighting to identify that the part itself had been marked. There are some other techniques to make sure that the marking was the authentic one and it was coming from the right place. But I think what the question was how economical. Is that correct? How economical is it?
Yeah, basically the question reads, won't it be effective and economical if the suppliers mark each of the items with some kind of marking that can be verified by the end user? But I think that's pretty much what counterfeits do. I mean, they falsify any type of marking and seal and part numbering, and that again promotes the parts to the next level in the supply chain. So he's not talking about specifically this very sophisticated, I believe what you mentioned, a DNA type of marking, but I think he's talking about marking in general.
Okay. Well, just to kind of close on that thought, it's very obvious at Secure Components we're always telling our customers to go to the OCM or the authorized/franchise distributors before coming to procure from an unauthorized source like Secure Components. But when you do have the the spot, or you're in a situation where you have to source from outside those authorized supply channels, it makes sense to be able to invest, and it would cost a little bit more to authenticate and verify buying a truly part that has integrity to it.
Okay, thank you. One more question just popped up here from Pasquale. Pasquale is asking, and I believe I could answer this question, is if these standards will be developed also in Europe and Asia as separate standards. Well, the G19 committee under the SAE, to the best of my knowledge, for the time being, they are developing these standards which are made available to the industry via SAE. And SAE, it's an international standards development body, but most of the utilization of standards promoted by the SAE, they definitely are heavily used in North America. Nothing obviously prohibits organizations in Europe or Asia also from adopting SAE-based standards. I'm not aware of any similar efforts happening in Europe and Asia at this time. Maybe Todd, are you aware of any standards developments happening in Europe and Asia along the lines of the family of standards that we have under the G19?
You know, from traveling to and from Asia and meeting with those member body countries, it seems as if they are tying into the AS60ASQ program. And so I do not know of any other standards organizations or anybody else that is authoring standards or putting together an accredited conformity assessment program.
Thank you. Yeah, so again, under the auspices of the IAQG, or the International Aerospace Quality Group, an entity that I am very familiar with, what we have there, we have standards that are developed on a global level. They are harmonized, such as the 9120. 9120 is it's available here in the Americas, as well as in Europe and in Asia, and it's pretty much the same document along the way. But got to keep in mind that standards such as 6081 or 5553, they are not developed under the IAQG, so there is no real push for global harmonization of the standards, at least not for the time being. Maybe that will happen eventually, because I think that both industry and society realize that counterfeit is a global, it's a universal problem that has to be addressed on a global scale. So if we have harmonized standards that basically are attempting to mitigate that risk on a worldwide level, we would be much better off. It would be, I believe, very counterproductive if we start having regional standards being developed to try to address the same problem that basically the whole supply chain has to deal with. That's exactly what the IAQG attempts to do with 9100, 9120, 9110, and maybe we will find a way of making this set of counterfeit avoidance standards a truly international set of standards. And I think that was the last question, so I would like to once again thank you, both Todd and Matt, so very much for sharing your knowledge, your experience with the attendees here today. I would like to just remind everybody that this webinar was recorded and it will be made available for on-demand viewing later on, and all of those that attended this webinar will be provided with a link so where you can download a copy of today's presentation. On behalf of DNV, Secure Components, AS60ASQ, and Matt, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar and look forward to have you guys in the next round of similar events that will be promoted by DNV and our partners. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon wherever you are. Thank you.